how to melt a full container of alien clay. In today's video, we're going to show you how to melt an entire container of the alien clay so that it can be poured into a mold and processed further by changing the actual sculpt to our liking. Now, a container like this contains 4.75 pounds of material, and sometimes you want to melt the entire batch, which makes it practical that it comes in this container. It has a pour spout that makes it easy to pour once the material is liquefied, and handles that make it easier and safer to handle. The lid itself keeps the molten clay in the container so that it doesn't spill out when we're handling it out of the oven. Now, let's just jump into this project and see how it's done. Before we put the container into the oven to melt the clay, we're first going to remove the clay out of the container to remove the separation paper that's lined between the two rows of clay. I'm going to remove the rest of the clay out of the container to remove the lower separation paper, which allows the clay not to stick to the container itself for easier removal. The clay blocks are then placed back into the container. We're going to place the lid back on and then put it in the oven. Now, when heating up the entire batch like this, it's important to put the lid back on. It allows the heat to disperse equally, and also it prevents you from burning yourself when you're handling hot and liquid clay. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. We should cut up the clay to melt it much faster, like my colleague Greg does in his video here. Unfortunately, we cannot do that because we're melting the entire container, and the cut up clay would just take up too much space and possibly create a mess in the oven. Now, the shop oven is turned on. We're going to set our temperature to 212. As stated in the technical bulletin, the clay liquefies at 212 Fahrenheit and can be poured at that point. There are a number of options when it comes down to heating equipment for materials like clay. Temperature-controlled crock pots. I'm using a scientific or shop oven. Hot box with conventional temperature monitor, or warming oven dedicated to clay only. We don't recommend microwaving the material because of the uneven heating and potential burning. Now, you never want to pour a hot material into a cold mold. The heat exchange between the hot material and a cold mold will cause all kinds of imperfection on the face of your casting. To achieve the best surface finish, we recommend preheating the mold to at least 150 Fahrenheit. So if we take a closer look at the comparison shot of the clay that was poured into a cold mold versus the preheated mold, you can clearly see that the casting that came from the cold mold has some cold shutting, where the clay cooled down so fast that it just didn't fill the sections, but also has some peeling and tiny air bubbles going all over the surface, whereby the casting on the right, where the mold was preheated, is clean, crisp, and even captured some of the air bubbles that were in the mold. The clay and the mold are now positioned in the oven and allowed to heat up. Something to keep in mind when melting this quantity of clay in one single batch is that it will take a substantial amount of time to get it liquefied. The clay is now allowed 2 hours to warm up before we take it out to give it a stir. Do take note that I am wearing heat-resistant gloves when I'm handling the hot clay going in and out of the oven. After 2 hours of heating in the shop oven, the clay has softened enough that it can be mixed in the container. As a matter of fact, some of the components of the clay have separated. There's a clear liquid here that we want to mix back into the clay completely. So periodic premixing, as prescribed in the technical bulletin, is recommended to blend all the components back together. The alien clay is now topped off again with the lid, and the container is put back into the oven. Clay is now allowed an additional 2 hours to continue heating so that we can liquefy it to a pourable state. After the additional 2 hours in the warming oven, the clay has liquefied enough that we can now pour it in the mold. And we're going to first remove the alien clay and then also remove the mold out of the oven. So here you can see that the clay has liquefied, but because we have the lid on the container, we're safe from spilling and potentially burning ourselves with the hot molten clay. So whenever you are melting the entire container off the alien clay, it's a good practice to melt it with the lid on for your safety. The lid is now removed and we're going to stir the clay one more time to ensure everything is uniform, as the clay does separate when liquefying it. And then we're going to pour the material inside of our mold. The pour spout on the side of the container makes it easy for pouring of liquid clay into small or large molds, while keeping the hot material away from your fingers. Keep in mind that the mold that we're using is also preheated and will give us a much nicer finish on the surface of the casting, because there is no heat exchange being transferred from the casting material, the hot clay, to a cold mold. In this case, we have a hot mold and the surface finish of our casting will reflect it. Because of the preheated mold and the material being hot, we're going to allow the clay to cool down for 4 hours before demolding. Alright, now it's been 4 hours since we poured the alien clay into our preheated mold, and the clay has cooled down enough that we can demold it without distorting it. Now, you want to be mindful that depending on the shape and size of your mold, it may take longer for your casting to cool down. You don't want to disturb the casting too soon and deform the actual casting itself while it's still pliable and warm. And here you can see that the clay has captured all the fine detail of our mold, and our casting is now ready for further refinement based on our liking. Now, if you got inspired by this project and you would like to give your own projects a go and need some materials, you can visit any one of the Chavant distributors around the world. So, and there you have it, a step-by-step procedure that I use to melt the entire container of alien clay safely in its original packaging for pouring into molds. Now, the container itself is handy. It has these handles that protect me from burning my hands. Also has a cover that keeps the material inside a container when it's liquefied. And of course, to make the pour much easier, it has these convenient lips on 2 sides that makes it a much easier procedure pouring the material into a mold. Now, if you have an idea about what we should do next, please let us know down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. Keep up with our latest mold making, casting, and other videos. Remember to subscribe. Alien clay.